This video is sponsored by Surfshark. More on them later.
Hi, I'm an internet man and I'm here to tell you today that video game consoles don't really matter. Well, that's not strictly true, because if you didn't have a video game console, then, you wouldn't be able to go out and buy all the fun video games that come out from time to time, and that fear of missing out may well drive you to buy the latest video game console. Although you could just play it on PC, so maybe video game consoles are kind of pointless.
Extracting maximum value out of a new video game console has always been tricky given how competitive the industry has been since, like, the 80s onwards. Some consoles float to the top with absurd sales figures and outstanding commercial success, but in a bloated market with everyone scrapping for their slice of the action, inevitably some other consoles will sink to the bottom and disappear without a trace. It's my job today to not sound too unwell, but also to shine a light on some of the absolute worst consoles that have stained the pages of video game history, and also to determine how a console can be considered the worst of anything, since a lot of the fun, or lack thereof, often boils down to the games you're playing, and most of the time, they'll be created independently of the useless paperweight you're playing it on. I don't know, but it sounds like the sort of thing we're going to figure out as we go, so there's no use worrying about it now. You're much better off worrying about the strength of your internet security, and because of today's sponsor Surfshark, this is now a lot easier to manage. VPNs like Surfshark let you connect to servers across the globe, with Surfshark in particular having over 3,000 servers spread across 65 countries. You can access international streaming libraries and can continue to watch Peacemaker because, like, the HBO Max stuff in the UK without a VPN is very tricky to do. Plus, it's worth mentioning that there's some more serious applications, since online security is more important than ever these days, and Surfshark can help secure your data with industry-leading measures by using impenetrable encryption and the best VPN protocols around. So you can join public Wi-Fi and watch more of my videos safe in the knowledge that your personal data is being kept nice and safe. Surfshark is super easy to install and can run on unlimited devices on a massive number of different platforms, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 live customer support, that's a hell of a lot of good news. You can go to surfshark.deals/RabbidLuigi and enter the promo code RabbidLuigi for 83% off and 3 extra months for free. That link is also in this video's description if you don't fancy typing all of that out. Secure your connection now with Surfshark.
Anyway, time for some shitty consoles, I guess.
So, I don't have much of a format in mind for this video other than to start at the beginning and keep going until we run out of shitty consoles, and with that in mind, it all started when a massive cosmic expansion brought forth the Big Bang, and roughly 13.8 billion years later, some very smart boys at Atari created the 2600, a console that would dominate its way through a fledgling video game industry from the late 70s to the early 1980s. At a time when other console manufacturers were floundering around for a foothold in the market, Atari was striding forward with their bulletproof model of releasing simplistic but highly addictive games that almost emulated the feeling of having an arcade cabinet in your home, except that it can play a bunch of different games. Atari was so happy with what they were doing with the 2600 that they released a follow-up console, aptly called the 5200 because, the Atari 2600 2 is just like 2600 times 2. They're geniuses. Unless you've done your homework or lived during that time, you won't have heard much about this because while the 5200 boasted improved technology, it was too much of a departure from the 2600 to convince the public to buy it. It was heavier and clunkier, and the controller was this weird phone-looking thing that didn't appeal to fans of the 2600, and yet despite being so different, most of the 5200's library was made up of ported 2600 games with very few exclusives, so why wouldn't you save your money and just stick with the 2600? Not like you had long to think about it, since the 5200 came out in 1982, and the industry was only a few years away from... And in the wake of the worst crash the video game industry has ever seen, a lot of electronics manufacturers were very reluctant to put all their eggs into the video game console basket, and fully commit to their new machine being a console. We ended up getting a lot of entertainment systems, with Nintendo pulling the galaxy brain move of releasing a dedicated game console in the West under the name Nintendo Entertainment System to avoid association with the... And so as the games industry got its act together, we ended up with stuff like the Philips CDI, which was designed to be used for general entertainment mixed with edutainment media, but it was absolutely capable of playing video games on it, as I'm sure is known to many of you. This thing has such a weird mix of technology that it was very hard for developers to create games for it, and as such we ended up with a lot of full motion video games that played to the CDI's strength of just playing video. With a healthy mix of absolute nightmarescapes like the exclusive Zelda games that were somehow allowed to be released on there. Yeah, the rights deal was complicated and undoubtedly something that Nintendo regrets, but it did give us 3 of the worst Zelda games ever made, and a near infinite supply of memes and reaction faces. Probably a little ahead of its time, but also in the wrong place at the wrong time. Which, to tell you the truth, kinda sums up the 90s in general from a console standpoint. Technology was moving fast in lots of different directions, not all of them even remotely successful, and it meant that you had some console manufacturers who were betting on one particular thing paying off only for it to blow up in their face. Plus, with the rising cost of new technology making it more expensive to develop a new console, the risk involved with fully committing to one type of technology was pretty massive. Panasonic's 3DO was honestly kind of amazing with how much advanced tech was crammed into it, to the extent that 1 year before its release it was winning Time Magazine's 1993 Product of the Year. Do you know how many products come out in a year? It's more than 5! So the marketing took care of itself, and it was certainly a beefy boy capable of some really impressive graphical output at the time, but the 3DO was also catastrophically expensive, and despite starting out okay at launch, it didn't get enough games to warrant paying out so much, and Panasonic took too long to reduce the price, so no dice. That same year, Atari was still just about kicking and were trying to turn heads in the console market in the same way as they had done all those years ago. Their solution was to go big with technology, and so the Atari Jaguar has the distinction of being the world's first 64-bit console. Except it's actually 2 custom 32-bit processors, which absolutely isn't the same as 64 bits, but shh. It didn't matter though, because Atari were back in the big time and ready to do battle with Nintendo and Sega and hold up! Turns out, customizing the shit out of your hardware so that you can boast how advanced your games console is makes it kind of impossible for the average games developer to make something for your console. And so the Atari Jaguar collapsed after launch like a whoopee cushion, and by 1995, with the PS1 launching in the West, Atari sensed the end and closed the whole thing down, eventually pulling out of the console market entirely. Sad to see Atari go, but the good news is that when they were acquired by Hasbro at the turn of the century, the patents for the Jaguar were released into the public domain, and so some people have been using it to homebrew their own games for the system. The same cannot be said for the other big story of 1995, because while Sony was stealing a march on the competition with the PlayStation, and Atari were crumbling into dust, Nintendo was still trying to regain their composure after their deal with Sony fell through, and with the N64 still a year away, Nintendo were looking for some way of stealing the spotlight and putting a little too much stock into early stereoscopic technology that could, in theory, create a truer sense of 3D depth than ever before. This technology had been around since the mid-1980s, and when offered the chance to use tech in the creation of a game's console, Sega declined, stating their concerns over the single-color display and the chance of motion sickness.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
Oh, Nintendo, you silly fuckers, you do make me laugh sometimes. The Virtual Boy was kind of a disaster from start to finish, which didn't take too long since Nintendo worked out they had a dud on their hands by the end of 1996, after months of lowering the price in a desperate attempt to clear their stock. This thing is like the worst case scenario of everything we've talked about so far, and a little bit more, since the tech behind it was very advanced and not even fully implemented by the time that the Virtual Boy was shipped, and so developing for it was extremely difficult. But also, people weren't used to jamming a lump of plastic on their heads to play video games, and the complaints of headaches and nausea did little to help the Virtual Boy's public image. In trying to make the world's first fully 3D console, Nintendo instead successfully created the world's first truly dangerous console, with a 1995 issue of Electronic Engineering Times throwing enough hyperbole around to state that it could cause permanent brain damage. Probably not, but it'd be appropriate since I'm pretty sure the people who made the Virtual Boy weren't exactly firing on all cylinders. It's the thinking man's games console, obviously. Once you get past the 90s and move into the 2000s, you start to see less and less console manufacturers creating hardware that plugs into the back of a TV, since I reckon they saw how impenetrable that market was now that Nintendo and PlayStation were doing battle, and a juggernaut like Microsoft had just thrown their hat into the ring, so fuck that. However, the handheld console market still seemed attainable, and if a company could create something that could rival Nintendo's Game Boy that has just been slowly updating itself since the late 80s, then there's money to be made there. Not many of them did, otherwise Nintendo would have had a harder time over the last 20 years, but there's still been some crazy attempts at breaking into this market. Remember, this is some time before mobile phone gaming took off, as long as you don't count a low-res version of Breakout as gaming. Although I do remember playing this, tennis game on my Motorola flip phone that was really fun. all you kids who've had iPhones from the age of 7 have no idea. Anyway, in 2002, Nokia stepped into the ring with the N-Gage, which Wikipedia ambitiously refers to as a smartphone, since technically the N-Gage is capable of playing video games and still being a phone. It's a weird mix of ideas, since it's clearly styled to lure people away from the Game Boy Advance, but its buttons are still too focused on being a phone and aren't conducive to being a games console. It can't really do either side very well, but since it has a lot of tech behind it, it costs the equivalent of over $400 of today's money, and unsurprisingly, people in the early 2000s had better things to spend their money on. It could play Rayman 3 quite well though, so there's a silver lining. If Nokia creating a handheld was misguided, then holy shit are we in for a ride of bad decision making, because it's time to talk about the Gizmondo. This thing came out a bit later in 2005, at which point Nintendo had moved on to the DS and Sony was starting to roll out the PSP, and yet you've got the Gizmondo over here still looking like a GBA knockoff. However, its manufacturer Tiger Telematics had money to burn, and my god did they roast it. With an extravagant marketing strategy that included celebrity parties and a sponsored car at the 24 Hours at Le Mans that didn't finish. Gizmondo and Tiger Telematics were bankrolled by Stefan Eriksson, a man who made his fortune from organised crime in Sweden and made headlines around the world for crashing his Ferrari Enzo into a pole at 200 miles an hour and somehow not dying. Fucking cut the thing in half though. That was in 2006, roughly around the same time as Tiger had gone bankrupt, since all that lavish spending didn't come close to breaking even, and in fact, the Gizmondo was such a pile of crap that it launched in the US with only 8 games to play, launched in the UK with only 1 game to play, and never got any more, eventually topping out at a measly 25,000 units sold, comfortably the lowest selling console of all time. The story behind it is more entertaining than any of the games they made for it. Not sure that's what they were going for though. And if that sounds bad, and don't worry, it is, Mattel made a console that only had 5 games for it. Mattel are a funny company since they're absolutely massive the world over, with the likes of Barbie and Hot Wheels being staples in just about every kid's bedroom on the planet, but they never quite got the hang of console manufacturing. I say that, but their electronics division were responsible for creating the Intellivision, which was basically the only console to challenge Atari's 2600, so they're not completely useless. Nearly 3 decades later, and yeah, they are a bit useless since the Hyperscan came out the same year as the Nintendo Wii, and with the Wii looking all sleek and modern, the Hyperscan looks like something you'd find in a charity shop, even in 2006. The whole gimmick is that you can scan these cards to do things, and it attempted to dip into the card collecting market that had done wonders for the likes of Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Problem is, there wasn't enough games to make it worthwhile, and it also locked large chunks of these games behind a paywall in a frightening parallel to loot boxes doing something similar these days. If you don't have the right character card, you can't play as that character. Some games never released all their cards to the public, so there's parts of these games that can never be accessed without hacking. Even if the system itself was fairly cheap, buying all the booster packs could get very pricey, and it's just not worth it. I'd rather put a hole in my TV with a Wii remote. On that subject, you may have noticed that it's been a while since we talked about one of the big hitters, and that's because, honestly, the Virtual Boy was the last major fuck-up that the likes of Nintendo or Sony have made on the industry. That was until 2011, when Nintendo were maintaining their momentum from the DS with the release of the 3DS. A risky return to stereoscopic 3D, but one that caused fewer headaches and, crucially, was easier to develop for since not every game had to be in 3D. Meanwhile, Sony were playing catch-up since while the PSP was an impressive bit of kit and actually a lot of fun to play games on, it was never quite able to wrestle the impetus away from Nintendo. And so in came the PS Vita as a reaction to the 3DS, although with less of a marketing push, since the Vita wasn't significantly different enough to the PSP beyond being more powerful. Sony's stance of handhelds is a little different to Nintendo, since a lot of the marketing behind the PSV and the PS Vita were to show off its powerful hardware as a way of playing the kind of fancy 3D games that home consoles are capable of. The PS Vita in particular went in harder on this concept and angled itself as the home of bigger budget games, especially since mobile gaming was just starting to gather momentum. Problem was that within its first year, PS Vita sales, and indeed the sales of these big budget games, ground to a crawl, and so Sony changed its strategy to instead pump the console with indie games. Which is fine, since it helped to build a dedicated fan base for these types of games, but it also meant that the Vita had no chance of reaching the kind of figures that it was supposed to. It was discontinued in 2019, and Sony have stated they have no plans whatsoever to dip back into the handheld market. At least until they work on some kind of Switch clone. And actually, it's a sign of how far the console market has come that we're now mainly looking at 3 main consoles and not a lot else. Maybe the Steam Deck, but the Stadia is still a joke. Just lucky that I don't care enough yet to talk about it in a video like this. Development is more expensive than ever, and with Sony's and Microsoft efforts in particular, it's a tricky arms race to have the most powerful machine capable of the best performance at the highest resolution. Crazy to think then that it was only about 10 years ago that a Kickstarter project was aiming to upset the apple cart and launch a unique competitor to the mainstays in the console industry that promoted a sense of customizability and affordability. The Ouya was a nifty idea that may have shaken things up if it was around 10 years prior, but despite raking in $8.5 million through Kickstarter, the console was cheaply made and far too reliant on a business model that few developers adopted. All games had to have a free-to-play component like a demo, but all that meant was that the Ouya store was full of casual mobile games and animated wallpapers. Ouya ended up wasting most of its money on poor marketing that didn't really work, and even its distribution to Kickstarters were pretty chaotic. Again, not entirely terrible ideas, but it was trying to penetrate a cast iron industry that was too comfortable with its ways to accommodate something so slapdash. Micro consoles may well be the future, but they sure weren't the past. So yeah, that was a lot of terrible consoles. There's likely some that I've missed and some that I could have spent a bit more time on, but hopefully I've covered like the last 40-ish years of terrible consoles in some decent detail. If you held me up at gunpoint and asked me to pick the worst console ever, I'd probably say the Gizmondo, but the story behind it is so wild that I'm honestly thankful for its existence. So maybe the Virtual Boy for being just such a half-assed attempt at being innovative that backfired spectacularly. This is always going to happen going forward since the console industry is incredibly lucrative, so who knows? Maybe in 40 years I'll make another video like this and demonstrate just how little has changed. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to make YouTube videos about it.
So I guess consoles do matter a little bit, because if you want to be able to attract the best, most popular games of the era, you need a machine that's able to run it. I'm just very thankful that my parents never really bought me any of these consoles growing up. Like, imagine wanting a PS1 and they bring home a Virtual Boy. I'd be heartbroken. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more in the future, and there's also one here if you want to watch one right now about the best open world video games. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including the Green Scorpion, Sarah Malion, and Devon Hutt. Thank you for watching, and please let Sweden make more consoles.